Hall. We're going to go to Orem next, where Deborah has a question about the Article 1 project. Deborah, you're on the line with the Congressman and Senator.
Hello, Deborah.
Hello, gentlemen. How are you?
Doing great, thank you.
Good. I pay attention, or try to pay attention to what's going on, and I watch people like Trey Gowdy and Jason Chaffetz, and how they are like dogs on a bone, but yet when it comes right down to the end, they have no peace. They're almost impotent because the DOJ will do nothing. So let's say that your Article 1 goes through. What happens then when Obama signs an executive order and once again pays no attention to the Congress? Does your bill have teeth?
Okay, Deborah, first of all, it's important to understand the Article 1 project is not limited to a single piece of legislation. This is a broad categorical approach that will be a multi-year long effort to develop legislation in 4 principal areas, one of them dealing with regulatory overreach and excessive delegation of legislative power to executive branch bureaucracies. Another of which involves excessive executive discretion, sometimes facilitated by acts of Congress. Yet another involves an effort to reform the budgeting process, reclaiming the power of the purse, and ending the congressional practice that has been longstanding of legislating by cliff. Legislating by cliff refers to the practice by which Congress sets a deadline at which its funding stream is set to expire, and then drops a piece of legislation just days or even hours or minutes before that deadline hits, and members are given a single binary choice. Either vote to pass whatever bill is put on the table, or risk a government shutdown. That's a horrible choice. So we're trying to deal with those 4 areas. In each of those 4 areas, we believe that there are a number of legislative proposals, some of which have already been developed, some of which we are developing. This is an internal think tank. So, Deborah, I wish I could tell you that we had a solution that would stop President Obama in his tracks anytime he wants to issue an executive order that violates the Constitution, that he is not authorized by statute or by some provision of the Constitution. I can't tell you that. But what I can tell you is that in the long run, we can discourage, we can even make far less likely the possibility that future presidents will do this. Sadly, one of the things that happens when we elect a president is we entrust that person with an enormous amount of discretion. It's often said that possession is 9/10 of the law. Nowhere is that more true than with respect to the occupant of the Oval Office. That's why we've got to be very careful about the kinds of people we allow in there. It's also another reason why we have to be very careful about how we draft federal law. Over time, we've given enormous discretion to the president by congressional mandate, by statute, and that has to end. We're trying to turn this around. So if what you're looking for with the Article 1 project is a quick fix to stop President Obama immediately in his tracks, I can tell you that that one isn't likely, because of the fact that there are so many statutes that facilitate exactly what he's doing. But what we're trying to do is turn that around, and we can make that less likely. In the meantime, one of the few things that we can do is to withhold funding from the president in his implementation of an unconstitutional executive order. I've fought to do that many times. When the president tried to rewrite Obamacare multiple times without statutory or congressional or constitutional authority, back in 2013, I sought to defund his efforts to implement those programs. When President Obama issued his executive orders granting executive amnesty, I sought to defund those. Sadly, we've had a Congress that has been all too compliant in continuing to fund the president in his unlawful and often unconstitutional acts. Mine has at times been a voice that has been joined by many others in the House and the Senate. So far, it hasn't been enough. But I can tell you this, Deborah, every time Congress passes an omnibus spending measure that doesn't rein in the president's excesses, his abuses of his constitutional prerogatives, we re-empower him. You remember a few weeks ago when Congress passed a 2,242-page spending bill. That bill spent well over $1 trillion. It was negotiated in secret by 4 members of Congress. 1 Republican and 1 Democrat from the Senate, 1 Republican and 1 Democrat from the House. The names of those 4 people are McConnell, Reid, Pelosi, and Ryan. That bill was negotiated over the course of weeks or months by those 4 members of Congress alone. It was then dropped on the American people, dropped on Congress, with 48 hours to go before a deadline, 48 hours before it was voted on. Members of Congress were not given a single opportunity to amend or improve that bill. And Congressman Ratcliffe and I watched in horror as most of our colleagues voted for that legislation without ever having read it. They voted for that legislation notwithstanding the fact that it re-empowered the president to engage in his acts of executive overreach. I'm sad to report, Deborah, that I was the only member of Utah's congressional delegation to vote against that legislation. But I did so in part in fulfillment of a promise that I made to voters throughout Utah when I first sought office in 2010, which is that if leaders in Congress don't give me time to read and understand and know the contents and examine the contents of what's in legislation, I'll vote against it. And I'll do so with even more vigor when I know that that's going to empower the president in his unconstitutional abuses of his power.
Great response, Mike. Can I just add something?
Please do.
So Deborah, I was struck as I heard your question, just the tone of your voice, and has reminded me of so many conversations I've had with folks in my district, and essentially they all say the same things, which is, why don't you stand up to the president? Why are you letting these agencies get away with, agencies like the EPA and the IRS with all of these, these agency overreach? Why doesn't Congress do something? And, I have a tremendous sense of urgency and frustration both in trying to provide solutions to the folks in my district. And as the senator said, he launched this project to deal with that. I wish that we didn't have to have this conversation, but really that's the idea. This isn't a single bill. This is a project where we're bringing together like-minded folks to focus on what solutions we can provide and mechanisms. Some of it is dealing with the legislation that we currently have. Some of it's dealing with the fact that we've had a Supreme Court chip away at congressional authority. One of the cases that the senator and I have talked about, there's a Supreme Court case that says that federal agencies, so long as there's congressional ambiguity, they have the right to interpret that any way they deem appropriate, so long as it's reasonable. And what that allows is those agencies to create more regulations, even if that wasn't the original congressional intent. So we're getting together with like-minded folks and trying to come up with these solutions over time. So we'll work as quickly as we can, but again, I think it's important that Senator Lee get credit for trying to bring together bold, energetic, optimistic voices that are going to provide solutions. We can't just be a party that, and individuals up here, and frankly a Congress that votes no. We've got to provide solutions. We've got to be a proposition party. And that's really what he's trying to do, and why I'm grateful to have the opportunity to be doing it with him. So the folks of Utah are very well served by the senator in this regard, and I know that we're going to, with the folks that he's assembled as part of this project, to come up with those solutions that are so desperately needed and that are reflected in your question and in your voice.